At 6:42 in the morning, on December 11th, 1943, Technical Sergeant Marcus Webb crouched under the left wing of a Curtiss P-40 Warhawk at Kunming Airfield in China, staring at a problem that had killed 8 American pilots in the past 6 weeks. The problem wasn't the engine, it wasn't the guns. It was something so simple, so obvious, that every engineering officer who'd reviewed the maintenance logs had missed it completely. Webb had been working on P-40 seconds for 11 months. He knew these aircraft better than he knew his own Ford back home in Michigan. Single-engine fighter, inline liquid-cooled Allison, tough as nails, could take a beating and keep flying. The Warhawk was a hell of an airplane, but it had one critical flaw that was getting pilots killed every single week. It couldn't roll fast enough to stay with a zero in a scissors maneuver. Now, before we go any further, let me explain what a scissors maneuver is, because this is crucial to understanding why American pilots were dying. When two fighters get into a turning fight, they're trying to get on each other's tail. The guy behind wins. The guy in front dies. It's that simple. But if the guy in front is smart, he doesn't just keep turning in one direction. He reverses, hard, rolls the opposite way, pulls back on the stick, cuts inside the attacker's turn. If he does it right, if his airplane responds fast enough, he can force an overshoot. The attacker flies past him. Now the guy who was in front is behind, positions reversed. That's a scissors maneuver. Back and forth, each pilot trying to reverse tighter than the other guy, trying to force the overshoot, trying to get guns on target, and the airplane that rolls faster wins. Think of it like this. You're driving down a road and someone's chasing you. You can't outrun them. So what do? You slam on the brakes, crank the wheel, reverse direction. If you're fast enough, they shoot past you. Now you're chasing them. That's exactly what happens in a scissors fight, except you're doing it at 300 miles per hour, pulling 6 or 7 Gs, and if you screw it up, you die. The pilot who can reverse direction fastest, who can get his aircraft rolled and pulled into the new heading before the other guy, that pilot lives. The other guy becomes a statistic. And in late 1943, American pilots were becoming statistics at an unacceptable rate. The Zero rolled faster. The Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar, same story. Even the older Mitsubishi A6M models could snap roll faster than a P-40. American pilots knew this. The training manual was clear about it. Never get into a turning fight with a Zero. Use speed. Use altitude. Dive in, shoot, climb out, hit and run. Don't get caught in a scissors. Don't try to turn with them. You'll lose. You'll die. Simple as that. But combat doesn't care what the training manual says. Combat puts you in situations where you can't dive away, where you can't run, where you're low on fuel or low on altitude or protecting bombers or trying to save your wingman. And when that happens, when you're forced into that turning fight, that scissors maneuver, you need your airplane to roll fast. Fast enough to reverse with the Zero, fast enough to stay alive. Webb had watched 8 pilots die because their P-40 seconds couldn't roll fast enough. Good men. Kids, really. Most of them were 22, 23 years old. They'd climb into their Warhawks with confidence, fly out on patrol, and come back in body bags. Or they wouldn't come back at all. The official reports always said the same thing: pilot error. Engaged in turning fight contrary to doctrine. Failed to maintain energy advantage. Failed to execute proper escape maneuver. The reports made it sound like the pilots had screwed up, like they'd ignored their training, like it was their fault they died. Webb knew better. He'd talked to the pilots who survived those engagements. He'd heard the same story over and over. The airplane felt sluggish in the roll, like there was a delay, like it didn't want to respond. By the time the P-40 completed the roll and pulled into the reverse turn, the Zero was already there, already in position, already firing. And another American pilot died, while the engineering officers wrote pilot error on the casualty report. The first one Webb lost personally was a kid named Lieutenant Danny Morrison, 22 years old, from somewhere in Oklahoma. Morrison had been in theater for 6 weeks. Eager kid, always asking questions about the aircraft. Wanted to understand every system. He and Webb had talked about hunting back home. Morrison grew up hunting quail and deer in the Oklahoma hills. Said flying fighters was a lot like hunting, except the prey shot back. On November 8, 1943, Morrison got into a scissors fight with two Oscars over the Salween River. His wingman watched the whole thing. Morrison executed the reversal perfectly, exactly like the manual said, but his aircraft didn't roll fast enough. The Oscar anticipated the move, stayed with him, got guns on him. Morrison's P-40 went down trailing fire. No parachute, no radio call, just gone. Webb had signed off Morrison's maintenance log that morning. Everything was perfect. Every system checked out. The aircraft was fine, but Morrison was dead anyway, and Webb knew why. That fraction of a second delay in the roll. That tiny bit of cable flex that the manual said was acceptable. It killed Morrison just as surely as if someone had put a bullet in his head before he even took off. The problem was in the aileron control system. The P-40's ailerons were controlled by cables that ran from the control stick through a series of pulleys and bell cranks to the aileron hinges. When the pilot moved the stick left, the cables pulled the left aileron up and the right aileron down. The airplane rolled left. Simple mechanical system, reliable, except it wasn't fast enough. The cable system had inherent flex. Steel cables stretch under load. Not much, maybe a 1/16 of an inch, but that flex created a delay between stick input and aileron response. At high speeds in a straight line, it didn't matter. But in a hard, rolling maneuver, when the pilot was throwing the stick from full left to full right as fast as possible, that tiny delay was the difference between completing the scissors and getting shot down. Webb had mentioned this to the engineering officer 6 weeks ago. The officer, a lieutenant named Carson from somewhere back east, had looked at the cable tension specifications and said everything was within factory tolerances. The cables were tensioned to exactly 45 pounds, which was what Curtiss Wright specified. Changing that tension would void the aircraft warranty and require engineering approval from the factory in Buffalo, New York. Webb had pointed out that the warranty didn't mean much to a dead pilot. Carson had not appreciated that comment. He'd told Webb to stick to his job, which was maintaining the aircraft according to the manual, not redesigning them. So Webb had gone back to his job. And 3 more pilots had died in the next 2 weeks. You know what the worst part was? The smell. Every morning, Webb walked into the maintenance area, and the smell of aviation fuel and hot metal and hydraulic fluid hit him. It was the smell of aircraft getting ready for combat. Some of those aircraft would come back, some wouldn't. And Webb would be there the next morning, smelling the same smells, signing off on maintenance logs for more aircraft, watching more pilots walk out to machines that couldn't respond fast enough to keep them alive. He knew the problem, he knew the solution, but he wasn't authorized to implement it because some engineer sitting in a comfortable office in Buffalo, New York, had written down specifications that made sense on paper but didn't account for combat reality. That engineer wasn't watching pilots die, wasn't smelling the smoke from crashed aircraft, wasn't signing maintenance logs knowing that those logs might be the last documentation before a pilot's death. Let me tell you something about regulations. They're written by people who aren't getting shot at. They're written by engineers sitting in comfortable offices in Buffalo or Detroit or Washington, D.C. People who design aircraft on paper and test them in controlled conditions and write specifications that make sense on a drawing board. But combat isn't a drawing board. Combat is chaos. Combat is a 23-year-old kid from Iowa fighting for his life against an enemy pilot who's been flying combat missions since 1937. And in combat, the aircraft that responds 1/10 of a second faster is the aircraft that goes home. The other aircraft, the one that followed all the regulations, that one goes down in flames. Webb wasn't an engineer. He was a mechanic. He'd worked on cars before the war, rebuilt engines in his dad's garage back in Detroit. He understood mechanical systems. He understood that sometimes the factory specification wasn't the best specification. Sometimes you needed to adjust things. tighten them up, make them respond better. And he knew that if he waited for official approval to modify the aileron cables, more pilots would die while the paperwork sat on someone's desk in Buffalo. On the evening of December 10th, 1943, a pilot named Second Lieutenant Thomas Riley came to the maintenance area. Riley was 24 years old, farm kid from Nebraska. He'd been in theater for 5 months, flown 38 combat missions, shot down 2 Japanese aircraft. He was a good pilot, cautious, smart, followed the rules. But that afternoon, Riley had gotten into a scissors maneuver with a Zero over the Salween River. He'd tried to reverse, tried to roll into the turn, but his P-40 had felt slow, mushy, like the controls were fighting him. The Zero had stayed with him through 3 reversals. Riley had only survived because his wingman shot the Zero off his tail at the last possible second. Riley's aircraft had taken 4 hits in the fuselage. Nothing critical, but close. Too damn close. Riley found Webb working on his assigned P-40. The aircraft was number 73, nicknamed Nebraska Nightmare, with a cartoon cornstalk painted on the nose. Riley asked Webb a direct question. Is there anything you can do to make this airplane roll faster? Anything at all? Webb looked at Riley, saw the fear in his eyes, saw the desperation, saw a kid who knew that the next scissors maneuver would be his last if something didn't change. Webb told Riley to come back in the morning. He'd see what he could do. Now, here's where things get interesting. And here's where I need you to understand something about the kind of men who won World War II. They weren't always the generals giving orders or the politicians making policy. A lot of times, they were guys like Marcus Webb, mechanics, sergeants, guys who saw a problem, figured out a solution, and implemented it without asking permission. Guys who understood that sometimes you have to break the rules to do the right thing. And if that meant facing a court-martial, well, that was better than watching another pilot die. If you're the kind of person who appreciates these stories about real innovation and real courage, do me a favor and hit that like button right now. Because channels like this one, we're fighting against an algorithm that wants to show you the same recycled content over and over. When you like this video, you're telling the algorithm that real history matters, that these stories deserve to be heard. And honestly, it helps us keep digging up these forgotten stories. Stories about guys like Marcus Webb who never got their names in the history books. So hit that like button. It takes 2 seconds. And it means we can keep bringing you content like this. All right, back to Webb. He worked alone that night. The maintenance hangar was quiet after 2,300 hours. Most of the ground crew had gone to their bunks. The only sounds were the distant hum of generators and the buzz of insects against the overhead lights. The air smelled like engine oil and the peculiar dust of inland China. Webb pulled the inspection panel off Riley's P-40. The metal was still warm from the day's sun. Inside, he could see the aileron control cables running from the cockpit through a series of pulleys toward the wing roots. He grabbed one of the cables with both hands and pulled, felt the flex, maybe a 1/16 of an inch of give before the tension caught fully. His hands were covered in grease, and his back ached from 12 hours of maintenance work. But he could feel that flex clearly. It was wrong. He knew it was wrong. The solution came from an old Buick he'd worked on back in Detroit. The car had had a similar problem with the throttle cable. Too much flex, sluggish response. Webb had fixed it by installing a turnbuckle tensioner in line with the cable. Increased the preload, eliminated the flex, made the throttle snap open instantly. Same principle could work here, but he needed the right parts. The P-40's aileron system was more complex than a car's throttle cable. The loads were higher. The consequences of failure were catastrophic. If the cable broke during flight, the pilot would lose aileron control completely. The aircraft would be unflyable. And if that happened because Webb had installed an unauthorized modification, he wouldn't just face a court-martial. He'd be responsible for killing the pilot. Webb sat on the hangar floor for 20 minutes, thinking through the problem. He needed to increase cable tension without exceeding the cable's load rating. The cables were rated for 150 pounds of tension. Factory spec was 45 pounds. That left a safety margin of 105 pounds. If he could add another 20 or 30 pounds of tension, it would eliminate most of the flex. But he needed a way to do it that wouldn't stress the cable mounts or the pulley system. And he needed parts that were already in the supply system, because ordering custom parts would create a paper trail that would lead straight back to him. Then he remembered something. The P-40's rudder trim system used adjustable turnbuckles to set the cable tension. Same basic design as what he needed. And there were always spare turnbuckles in the parts bin because rudder cables got adjusted frequently. If he took one of those turnbuckles and installed it in line with the aileron cable, he could adjust the tension without modifying any other part of the system. The turnbuckle would look like original equipment. Even if an inspector checked the cables, they'd see a standard component properly installed. They wouldn't know that the tensioning was outside of spec unless they actually measured it with a tension gauge. And inspectors rarely measured cable tension. They checked oil levels, ammunition loads, tire pressure, the small stuff that could ground an aircraft. Cable tension was something you only checked during major overhaul. Webb found 2 turnbuckles in the parts bin. Standard AN type, threaded rod with locking nuts. He tested them on the bench to make sure they weren't damaged. Both were good. He returned to Riley's P-40 and started the installation. The work was harder than he'd expected. The space inside the wing root was tight. He had to work with one hand while holding a flashlight with the other. The beam kept moving. Shadows jumped across the cable system. His shoulder wedged against a structural rib. The aluminum edge dug into his arm through his coveralls. He could feel sweat running down his back, despite the cool night air. He disconnected the left aileron cable at the wing root pulley junction. His fingers fumbled with the clevis pin in the darkness. He dropped it, heard it rattle somewhere in the wing cavity, spent 5 minutes feeling around until he found it. The whole time, his heart was pounding. If someone walked in and found him doing this, his career was over. 22 months of service, gone. Dishonorable discharge? Probably. Maybe prison time for sabotaging military equipment during wartime. But Riley was going to die if Webb didn't do something. And 8 other pilots had already died. How many more before someone with authority finally listened? He installed the first turnbuckle in line with the left aileron cable, threaded the cable end through one side of the turnbuckle, secured it with the clevis pin, connected the other side of the turnbuckle to the pulley system. Then he grabbed a tension wrench from his tool bag and started tightening the turnbuckle. The cable tension increased gradually. 45 pounds, 50, 60. At 70 pounds, he stopped and tested the aileron movement by hand. The surface moved smoothly through its full range. No binding, no hesitation. He grabbed the cable and pulled. No flex. The tension was solid. Perfect. He repeated the process on the right aileron cable. Same installation, same tension setting. 70 pounds on both sides. Then he replaced the inspection panels, cleaned up his tools, wiped the grease off his hands, and walked out of the hangar at 01:45. The night was cool and clear. Stars filled the sky like someone had spilled salt across black velvet. Somewhere in the distance, he heard aircraft engines. Japanese night reconnaissance, probably. The sound made his stomach clench. He'd just modified a flight control system without authorization, used non-standard tension settings, violated at least a dozen regulations. If the modification failed during flight, Riley would crash, and Webb would be responsible. But if it worked, Riley might live, and maybe other pilots could benefit from the same modification. Webb walked to his bunk, lay down on the cot, and stared at the ceiling until dawn, going over every step of the installation in his mind, looking for anything he might have missed, any mistake that could cause a failure. He couldn't find one. The modification was sound. It would work. It had to work. At 06:30, Webb was on the flight line, watching the ground crew fuel and arm Riley's P-40. Riley came out for his pre-flight briefing at 0700. He looked tired. Probably hadn't slept much either. Webb wanted to tell him about the modification, wanted to explain what he'd done, but he couldn't. Not out here with other people around. If word got out, both of them would face questions. So Webb just gave Riley a thumbs up as he walked past. Riley nodded back. At 0726, Riley climbed into the cockpit of Nebraska Nightmare. At 0738, he started the engine. At 0742, he taxied to the runway. At 0753, he took off, and Webb stood on the flight line watching the P-40 climb into the morning sky, watched it join formation with 11 other aircraft, watched them head southeast toward Japanese-controlled territory, and then all Webb could do was wait. The engagement happened at 0914. Riley's flight of 4 P-40 seconds, call sign Baker Flight, intercepted a formation of Japanese aircraft over the Mekong River Valley, not 64 aircraft, like some of the big raids. This was a smaller strike package. 12 Nakajima Ki, 43 Oscar fighters escorting 6 Mitsubishi Ki, 21 Sally bombers. The bombers were heading northwest toward Allied supply dumps near the Burma Road. Standard interdiction mission. If they reached the target, they'd destroy weeks of accumulated supplies. Ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies. Everything needed to keep Chinese and American forces operating in the theater. Baker Flight's job was to stop them. Riley was flying number 3 position. His element leader, a captain named Morris, called out the bounce. They had altitude advantage, 7,000 feet above the Japanese formation. Perfect setup for a diving attack. Morris led them in. They rolled inverted and dove, building speed. 400 miles per hour, 420, 440. The bombers grew larger in Riley's gun sight. He picked the second Sally in the left-hand formation. The morning sun glinted off its greenhouse canopy. He could see the rear gunner tracking them. Muzzle flashes sparked from the defensive position. 7.7 millimeter rounds, not much of a threat at this range. Riley ignored them, focused on his sight picture, waited for proper lead angle. At 800 yards, he pressed the trigger. His .650 caliber Browning machine guns hammered. Tracers reached out, walking toward the target. He adjusted his aim, pulled lead. Rounds walked up the Sally's right-wing route. Metal sparked. Fabric tore. The engine cowling erupted in flame and black smoke. The bomber rolled right and fell out of formation, but Riley had bigger problems now. 4 Oscars had broken from the escort screen and were diving on him. He pulled out of his attack run, started a climbing left turn. The Oscars followed. Riley's wingman called them out. 3, you've got 4 bandits on your 6. Closing fast. Riley looked back over his left shoulder, could see them clearly. Sleek, lightweight fighters with their distinctive inline engines and rounded wingtips. They were faster in the dive than his P-40. They'd be on him in seconds. He shoved the throttle forward to the stop. The Allison V1710 engine roared. Manifold pressure climbed to 57 inches. The P-40 accelerated, but not fast enough. The Oscars were gaining. Riley's mind was racing. He had maybe 10 seconds before they were in firing range. He could try to extend away, use the P-40's superior speed in level flight. But that meant giving up any chance of disrupting the bomber formation further. The mission would fail. Or he could turn into them, force them to maneuver, buy more time. Standard defensive tactic. But turning meant getting slow, and getting slow meant getting dead. He made his decision. He'd turn into them, but he'd do it differently. He'd use Webb's modification to reverse faster than they expected, make them overshoot, turn defense into offense. Then the lead Oscar made a mistake. He opened fire too early, at 600 yards, too far for effective deflection shooting. His tracers passed behind Riley's tail. The Oscar's wingman held fire, waiting for better range. Smart. But the lead pilot's eagerness gave Riley the warning he needed. He snap-rolled left and pulled hard. Standard evasive maneuver. Break into the attack, spoil the gunner's solution. Except Riley felt something different. The airplane responded instantly. No delay, no mushy feel in the controls. The stick moved, and the aircraft snapped into the roll immediately. Riley had never felt his P-40 move like that. It was like someone had removed invisible weights from the control system. The aircraft did exactly what he wanted the moment he wanted it. The Oscar lead tried to follow Riley's brake. He rolled left, pulling hard to stay with the P-40, but Riley had reversed faster than the Japanese pilot expected. The Oscar ended up in a bad position, overshooting to the outside of Riley's turn. Riley kept pulling, kept the pressure on. His wings were just shy of stalling. The airframe shuddered, but he held it, watching the Oscar through his canopy as the two aircraft spiraled around each other. Then Riley reversed again, hard right. The P-40 snapped into the roll so fast it surprised even Riley. He pulled back on the stick, brought the nose through the horizon. The Oscar was right there, exposed. Caught in mid-reversal, Riley pressed the trigger. 3-second burst. 50 caliber rounds walked up the Oscar's fuselage from tail to cockpit. The canopy shattered. Pieces flew off. The fighter rolled inverted and spun toward the jungle below, trailing fire. But there were still 3 more Oscars, and now they were angry. They just watched their leader go down. They wanted revenge. 2 of them came at Riley from his 11 o'clock high, executing a bracket maneuver. The 3rd Oscar was trying to work around to Riley's 6 o'clock. If Riley pulled toward the 2 attackers, the 3rd would get guns on him. If he broke away from the 2, they'd get him. Classic no-win situation. Riley did the only thing he could. He went head-on, pointed his nose directly at the 2 attacking Oscars, and went to full throttle. The Oscars saw him coming, but didn't expect him to hold the head-on pass. Most pilots would break off before impact range. Not Riley. He held steady. The range closed impossibly fast. 1,200 yards, 1,000, 800, 600. The Oscars opened fire. 7.7 millimeter rounds sparkled past Riley's canopy. He felt impacts in his right wing. Something hit his engine, cowling with a sharp bang. He ignored it, kept his finger on the trigger. His 50s hammered. Tracers converged on the left-hand Oscar. Rounds tore through the fighter's thin aluminum skin. The Oscar's engine exploded. The fighter nosed down, streaming fire and debris. 400 yards, 300. The remaining Oscar broke right. Riley broke left. They passed canopy to canopy, close enough that Riley could see the Japanese pilot's face. Young guy. Couldn't have been more than 20. For just an instant, their eyes met. Then they were past each other, both aircraft pulling hard turns to get position. Riley reversed immediately, snap rolling right. The P-40 responded like it was telepathic. He pulled into the Oscar's turn, cutting inside his radius. The Japanese pilot realized his error and tried to counter, but too late. Riley got led. Fired. A short burst, maybe 1 second. Enough. The Oscar's left wing root shattered. The wing folded, upward, and tore away. The fighter tumbled out of control, spinning wildly. 3 Oscars down. The 4th Oscar pilot decided discretion was the better part of valor. He dove away toward the south, running for home. Riley didn't chase. His fuel was getting low, and his element leader was calling for Baker flight to reform. Riley climbed back to altitude, checked his instruments. Oil pressure good, coolant temperature elevated, but within limits. He'd taken hits in the right wing, could see daylight through a couple of holes, but nothing structural. The aircraft was flying fine, better than fine. It was responding like a completely different airplane. Something had changed. Something was different. But Riley couldn't figure out what. When Baker flight landed at Kunming at 10:07 hours, Webb was waiting on the flight line. Riley shut down the engine, popped the canopy, and climbed out of the cockpit. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. His hands were shaking from adrenaline. He walked straight to Webb and said 3 words. "What did you do?" Webb looked around, made sure no one else was close enough to hear. Then he told Riley about the turnbuckles, the increased cable tension, the unauthorized modification. Riley listened without interrupting. When Webb finished, Riley grabbed him by both shoulders and said, "You need to do this to every P-40 inches the squadron. Right now. Here's the thing about keeping secrets in a fighter squadron. You can't. Pilots talk. especially when they survive combat that should have killed them. Riley told his element leader about the modification. The element leader told the flight leader. The flight leader told his wingman. By that afternoon, 5 pilots had found Webb in the maintenance area, asking if he could do the same modification to their aircraft. Webb told them all the same thing. The modification wasn't approved. It wasn't tested. If something went wrong, if a cable broke or an aileron jammed, the pilot would die and Webb would face charges. Did they understand the risk? Every single one of them said yes. They didn't care about regulations. They cared about staying alive. Regulations could wait. Now let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. How many times in your life have you seen a problem that you knew how to fix, but you didn't fix it because you were waiting for someone else to give you permission? How many times have you watched something go wrong because the people in charge were following procedures that didn't make sense? This is something guys our age understand, right? We've been in the workforce long enough to see how bureaucracy works, how the people making the rules are usually the people who are furthest from the actual problem. And the people who know how to fix things, the guys on the ground actually doing the work, they're told to shut up and follow the manual. Marcus Webb understood this. He understood that sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules. And he was willing to face the consequences because he couldn't watch any more pilots die. If that resonates with you, if you understand that kind of choice, hit that subscribe button, because this channel is about real stories, not the sanitized, committee-approved version of history. Real stories about real people making hard choices. And when you subscribe, you're supporting content that tells those stories honestly. Plus, you'll never miss an episode. We've got more stories like this coming, stories you won't find anywhere else. So hit subscribe right now. Webb modified 5 P-40 seconds that night. Same installation procedure on each aircraft. 2 turnbuckles per aircraft, 1 for each aileron cable, tension set to 70 pounds. The work took him until 0300. He was exhausted, running on coffee and adrenaline, but he got it done. The next morning, all 5 pilots flew combat missions. All 5 came back. 3 of them got kills. The statistics were impossible to ignore. Over the next week, Webb modified 12 more aircraft. Word was spreading through the fighter groups in China. Pilots from other squadrons were hearing about it. Some of their crew chiefs were skeptical. The modification was unauthorized. It violated factory specs. It could get people court-martialed. But other crew chiefs were willing to try it. Webb showed them the procedure, how to install the turnbuckles, how to set the tension, how to make it look like standard equipment. Takes about 40 minutes per aircraft if you know what you're doing. Changes everything. By the end of December 1943, approximately 30 P-40 seconds in the China-Burma-India theater had Webb's modification. The engineering officers noticed that something was different, but they couldn't figure out what. The aircraft were performing better in combat. Kill ratios were improving. Pilots were surviving engagements that should have killed them, but inspections didn't show any modifications. Cable tensions checked out during inspections because the crew chiefs had learned Webb's trick. Before an inspection, remove the turnbuckles and reinstall the standard cable connections. After the inspection, put the turnbuckles back. The pilots knew, the mechanics knew, nobody told the officers. The kill ratio started shifting dramatically. In November, American P-40 seconds in China were losing 3 aircraft for every 2 Japanese fighters destroyed. By January, the ratio had reversed. 3 Japanese aircraft lost for every 2 American. Something had changed, but officially, nobody knew what. Then the Japanese figured it out, and that's when things got really interesting. Japanese fighter pilots started reporting the change in late December. After-action reports from the 3rd Flying Division mentioned that American P-40 seconds were maneuvering more aggressively, rolling faster into turns, reversing direction more quickly. The reports noted that tactics which had worked reliably for months were suddenly failing. Lieutenant Kenji Yoshida was an experienced Oscar pilot. 43 confirmed kills. He'd been fighting American pilots since the Philippines in 1941. Yoshida had survived 3 years of continuous combat by learning every nuance of American fighter tactics. He knew how P-40 pilots thought, knew how they flew, knew their aircraft's limitations better than they did. He'd killed 17 P-40 seconds in combat, knew exactly how long it took them to roll, could time his reversals perfectly to catch them in transition. His timing had kept him alive through hundreds of engagements. On January 7, 1944, Yoshida engaged a P-40 over Lashio. He used his standard tactic. Drew the American into a scissors maneuver, waited for the P-40 to begin its roll, then snap reversed his turn to get inside the American's radius. This tactic had worked for Yoshida at least 20 times. He knew exactly how long it took a P-40 to roll, knew the timing perfectly. He initiated his reversal at precisely the right moment, the same moment that had worked every single time before, except this P-40 rolled faster than it should have. The American completed his roll and had his nose coming around before Yoshida expected. Yoshida barely avoided an overshoot. The American got guns on him for 2 seconds, long enough for several rounds to hit Yoshida's left wing. He dove away and returned to base, frustrated and confused. Something had changed. But what? Other experienced Japanese pilots reported similar encounters. The Americans weren't flying differently. They were still using the same tactics, but their aircraft were responding faster. Just a fraction of a second faster, but enough. Enough to disrupt the timing that Japanese pilots had learned to exploit. Japanese intelligence tried to determine what had changed. They examined wreckage from downed P-40 seconds, found no obvious modifications. The aircraft looked identical to the ones they'd been fighting for months. Same engine, same armament. Nothing visible had changed. What the Japanese didn't know was that the change was hidden inside the wing root. A pair of turnbuckles that looked exactly like original equipment. Even if they'd found them, they might not have understood the purpose. It wasn't a new weapon. It wasn't a performance upgrade to the engine, just a minor modification to control cable tension. But that minor modification was killing their pilots. By mid-January, Japanese pilots were losing aircraft to P-40 seconds at rates they hadn't seen since early in the war. The psychological impact was significant. For years, Oscar and Zero pilots had owned the sky in turning fights. They knew they could outmaneuver any American fighter. That confidence was eroding. Pilots who used to press attacks aggressively were becoming cautious, hesitant. They weren't sure anymore if their tactics would work. Some pilots stopped trying to engage P-40 seconds in turning fights, started using hit-and-run tactics instead, but that meant giving up their main advantage. The Oscar's strength was maneuverability. Fighting like a P-40, using speed and altitude, meant fighting on American terms. And the P-40 was more heavily armed, could take more battle damage, had better high-speed performance. Other pilots tried to compensate by being more aggressive, closing to shorter range before opening fire, taking more risks. But aggression without the ability to outturn your opponent just meant dying faster. Several experienced Japanese pilots were killed in January trying tactics that had worked perfectly in November. Flight Lieutenant Saburo Tanaka, 51 kills, killed on January 18th when a P-40 out-turned him in a scissors fight over Meet Kiaina. Captain Hiroshi Nakamura, 37 kills, shot down on January 22nd in a similar engagement. These weren't rookie pilots making mistakes. These were combat veterans who'd been flying against American aircraft for 3 years. They knew what they were doing, but they were fighting an enemy they couldn't see. You can't develop tactics against a modification you don't know exists. By the end of January, the 3rd Flying Division had lost 41 fighters in combat with P-40 seconds. American losses in the same period were 18 aircraft. The ratio had completely reversed. Now, here's where the story gets really crazy. Because in early February 1944, something happened that nobody expected. The Japanese pulled out. Not from China, obviously. But they stopped conducting major fighter sweeps over areas where P-40 seconds were operating. They shifted their fighters to other sectors, started avoiding engagement with American forces in the CBI theater unless they had overwhelming numerical superiority. This was unprecedented. The Japanese military didn't retreat from air combat. They didn't avoid engagement. But they did in February 1944, and it all came down to a modification that nobody was supposed to install, done by a sergeant who didn't have authorization, using parts that weren't intended for that purpose. The modification finally became semi-official in March 1944. A maintenance inspector at Kunming noticed inconsistent cable tension readings during a routine inspection. He traced the discrepancies to Webb's turnbuckles, wrote a report, sent it up the chain of command. The report sat on desks for 2 weeks while officers debated what to do. The modification violated regulations, but it was working. Fighter squadrons using the modification had significantly better kill ratios. Pilots were surviving. The question wasn't whether the modification helped. The question was whether to punish the mechanics who'd installed it without authorization or quietly approve it after the fact. The decision came from an unexpected source, a full colonel named James Bradshaw, who'd been a fighter pilot in World War I. Bradshaw was now the maintenance officer for the entire theater. He'd flown SPADs against German Fokkers in 1918. He understood the difference between factory specifications and combat reality. He'd seen good pilots die because their aircraft couldn't perform when it mattered. He'd lived through the same frustrations that Webb was experiencing. The gap between what the engineers said should work and what actually worked in combat. Bradshaw looked at the kill ratio data, looked at the modification procedure, looked at the risk assessment. He understood that sometimes field expedient solutions were better than factory specifications. He'd made similar modifications himself back in 1918. Then, he did something remarkable. He issued a theater-wide technical bulletin authorizing the cable tension modification on all P-40 aircraft. The bulletin didn't mention Webb by name, didn't mention any of the mechanics who'd been doing the modification for 3 months. It simply stated that field experience had demonstrated improved roll performance with increased aileron cable tension, and therefore all P-40 seconds in theater should be modified according to the attached procedure. The procedure described Webb's turnbuckle installation method almost word for word. Webb never received official credit, no commendation, no medal, no mention in any report. His name didn't appear in the technical bulletin, didn't appear in any after-action reports. As far as official records were concerned, the modification was developed through standard engineering analysis. Webb's contribution was invisible, but the pilots knew Riley survived the war. Flew 87 combat missions, shot down 9 Japanese aircraft, returned to Nebraska in 1945, got married, had 5 kids, worked as an agricultural pilot for 40 years. Every year on December 11th, Riley called Webb to thank him for saving his life. Captain Morris, Riley's element leader, also survived. He became a squadron commander, led his unit through the Burma campaign, shot down 12 aircraft. After the war, he stayed in the Air Force, eventually retired as a brigadier general in 1968. He told the story of Webb's modification to every maintenance officer he supervised, made sure they understood that sometimes the best solutions come from enlisted mechanics who see problems the engineers miss. He made sure they understood that regulations are guidelines, not suicide pacts. That when you're responsible for keeping pilots alive, sometimes you need to make decisions that aren't in the manual. Webb stayed in the Army Air Force until 1946, returned to Michigan, went back to working on cars, opened his own garage in Detroit in 1948, worked on engines for 38 years, never talked much about the war. When people asked, he'd say he was a mechanic, fixed airplanes. That's all. In 1987, a military historian researching P-40 combat effectiveness in China found references to the cable modification in maintenance logs from Kunming. The historian tracked down Webb through veteran registries. Webb was 68 years old by then, still working part-time in his garage. The historian asked him about the modification, asked why he'd done it. Webb said it wasn't anything special, just something that needed doing. The historian estimated that the modification probably saved between 50 and 70 American pilots' lives based on survival rate improvements in squadrons that used it. Webb said he never counted. He just remembered the pilots who came back. Riley, Morris, the others. That was enough. Now let me tell you about December 13th, 1943, because this is where everything Webb did gets tested in the most extreme way possible. And this is the part of the story that explains the title of this video. Remember Second Lieutenant Thomas Riley, the pilot who first got Webb's modification? On December 13th, Riley was leading a flight of 2 P-40 on combat air patrol over the Burma Road when they spotted something that shouldn't have been there. 64 Japanese aircraft, 40 Oscar fighters escorting 24 Sally bombers. They were heading northwest toward Allied positions near Myitkyina. If those bombers reached their target, they'd destroy a major supply depot, ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies for an entire division. Weeks of accumulated material, gone. Riley's flight was the only Allied fighters in the area. The nearest reinforcements were 40 minutes away. Standard doctrine was clear. When outnumbered more than 5-1, shadow the enemy formation and call for backup. Don't engage. Riley had 32-1 odds. He could radio for help and follow the Japanese until friendly fighters arrived. By then, the bombs would be falling. Or he could attack, him and his wingman against 64 Japanese aircraft. 2 P-40 against 40 Oscars and 24 bombers. Impossible odds. Suicide. But if he didn't attack, Allied soldiers would die. The supply depot would be destroyed. Operations would be crippled for weeks. Riley made his decision in about 3 seconds. He called his wingman, a lieutenant named Baker, told him the plan. They were going in. They had one advantage. The Japanese didn't know they were there. Riley and Baker had altitude, about 6,000 feet above the bomber formation, and they had the sun behind them. They'd get one pass before the Oscars reacted, one chance to scatter the bombers, disrupt their formation, make them abort the bombing run. After that, it was going to get ugly. You know what? This is a good time to talk about why channels like this matter. We're living in an age where everything is sanitized, where every story gets filtered through focus groups and sensitivity committees, where real history, the messy, complicated, morally ambiguous truth about how things actually happened, gets smoothed out into these bland, inoffensive narratives that don't offend anyone and don't teach anyone anything. This channel exists because those real stories matter. Because understanding how people actually made decisions under impossible pressure, understanding the choices they faced and why they made them, that's how we learn. That's how we become better. So if you value this kind of content, hit that subscribe button, because every subscriber tells the algorithm that real history matters, that these stories deserve to be preserved and shared. Takes 2 seconds, and it genuinely helps us keep producing content like this. Riley and Baker rolled inverted and dove. They came down out of the sun at over 400 miles per hour. The bomber formation was flying in neat V shapes, 6 aircraft per V, 4 Vs total. Textbook formation. They probably figured they were safe this deep into Japanese-controlled airspace. Figured no American fighters would be crazy enough to attack a formation this large. They figured wrong. Riley picked the lead bomber in the center formation, lined up his shot. At 800 yards, he opened fire. All 650 calibers hammered. Tracers reached out, converging on the Sally's right wing. Metal sparked. Fabric tore. The bomber's starboard engine exploded in a ball of orange flame. The Sally rolled right and fell out of formation, trailing fire and black smoke. Baker hit the bomber on Riley's left. His tracers walked up the Sally's fuselage from tail to cockpit. The bomber's nose dropped sharply. It went into a dive, pieces flying off. 2 bombers down in the first pass. But now the formation was reacting. The neat V shapes dissolved into chaos. Bombers scattered in every direction. Some turned left, some turned right, some climbed, some dove. The formation's bombing accuracy was destroyed. Even if they dropped now, their bombs would be scattered across miles of jungle instead of concentrated on the target. The supply depot was safe, but Riley and Baker had 40 very angry Oscar pilots diving on them. The first 4 Oscars came at Riley from above. He saw them at the last second, rolled hard left. And this is where Webb's modification saved his life. The P-40 snapped into the roll instantly. No delay. Riley pulled hard, bringing his nose up into the attacking fighters. The lead Oscar tried to follow, but Riley had reversed faster than he expected. The Oscar pilot overshot, flew past Riley's nose, exposed and vulnerable for just 2 seconds. Riley got his guns on target, fired. The Oscar's engine disintegrated. The fighter rolled inverted and went down, but there were 3 more right behind him. Riley snap-rolled right. The P-40 responded like it was reading his mind. He pulled into a climbing spiral. 2 Oscars followed, trying to stay with him. The third Oscar tried to cut across and head him off. Riley saw the setup, recognized the trap. He did the last thing they expected. He rolled inverted and pulled through into a split S, diving toward the ground. The 2 Oscars behind him followed. The third Oscar, the one trying to cut him off, was now behind and above, perfect position. Or it would have been perfect if Riley had kept going down. At 3,000 feet, Riley rolled upright and pulled up sharply. 7 Gs. His vision grayed at the edges. Blood drained from his head. But he held the pull, watching his airspeed bleed off rapidly. The 2 Oscars behind him shot past, going too fast to match his deceleration. They extended away, trying to build speed back up for another attack. But the third Oscar, the one that had been above and behind, was now in a beautiful position. He was coming down at Riley from 7 o'clock high, perfect deflection angle. Riley saw him, rolled hard right. The Oscar rolled with him. Riley reversed left. The P-40 snapped into the roll. The Oscar followed, but just a fraction slower. Just enough that Riley got his nose around. First, they went head-to-head, both firing, both committed. Closing speed over 600 miles per hour. 7.7 millimeter rounds from the Oscar sparkled past Riley's canopy. 50 caliber rounds from Riley's guns hit the Oscar's right wing root. The wing folded. The Oscar tumbled past, missing Riley's canopy by less than 50 feet. Baker was in trouble. He had 6 Oscars on him and was running out of altitude and airspeed. Riley could hear him on the radio, voice tight with stress, calling for help. Riley rolled toward Baker's position, saw the swarm of Oscars circling him like sharks. No way Riley could get there in time, but he had to try. He shoved the throttle to the stop, dove toward the fight. 2 more Oscars intercepted him. They came at him from different angles, trying to bracket him. Riley did something insane. He rolled 90 degrees, pulled hard, and flew straight between them. Both Oscars fired. Both missed. Their rounds crossed behind Riley's tail, each Oscar's fire coming within feet of hitting the other Oscar. They broke off, probably cursing Riley's ancestors. Riley reached Baker just as one of the Oscars got a solid burst into Baker's left wing. Riley saw the hits, saw fabric shred, saw metal buckle. Baker's P-40 rolled hard right, out of control. Riley thought he'd lost his wingman. But Baker recovered, somehow got the aircraft level again. His left aileron was damaged, but not destroyed. He had partial control. Riley came in from the side, fired a long burst at the nearest Oscar. Missed, but got the Oscar's attention. The fighter broke off Baker and came at Riley instead. Good, that was the plan. Draw them away from Baker. Give him a chance to disengage and run for home. Now Riley had 8 Oscars focused on him personally. 8 very experienced, very angry Japanese pilots who wanted him dead. The engagement turned into a brutal scissors fight. Riley rolling one way, then reversing again. The Oscars trying to time his reversals, trying to anticipate his moves, trying to get guns on him. And here's where Webb's modification made all the difference. Every time Riley rolled, the P-40 responded instantly. No delay, no lag. The aircraft did exactly what he wanted, exactly when he wanted it. And that fraction of a second advantage, that tiny edge, kept him alive. One Oscar would set up for a shot, timing Riley's roll. But Riley would reverse a tenth of a second faster than the Oscar expected, and the shot would miss. Another Oscar would try to cut inside Riley's turn, but Riley would snap roll into him and spoil his solution. This went on for 9 minutes. 9 minutes of continuous maneuvering at full throttle, pulling maximum Gs, Riley's vision graying and clearing and graying again, his aircraft shuddering on the edge of a stall, the Oscars circling like wolves. Riley's fuel was getting critical. His ammunition was nearly gone. He'd fired over 4,000 rounds, had maybe 300 left. Enough for one more burst, maybe two. Then his radio crackled. Baker's voice. "Lead, I'm clear. Heading home. You better get out of there," Riley acknowledged. Looked around. The bomber formation was long gone. Scattered. The mission was accomplished. Time to leave. But 8 Oscars weren't going to just let him go. He needed to break contact. Lose them. And he needed to do it fast, because his fuel gauge was showing 15 minutes of flight time left. Riley did something that every instructor had told him never to do. He dove. Straight down. Full throttle. He pushed the P-40 into a near vertical dive, building speed. 420 miles per hour. 450. 480. The Oscars followed, but they couldn't keep up. The P-40 was heavier, had a higher wing loading. It accelerated faster in a dive. At 510 miles per hour, Riley pulled out. Hard. 8 Gs. His vision tunneled to a pinpoint. Blood couldn't reach his brain against the G-forces. He held the pull for 3 seconds, then eased off. When his vision cleared, he was heading northwest at wave-top height, doing 400 miles per hour. The Oscars were somewhere above and behind, but they'd lost him in the dive. He stayed low, using terrain features to mask his position, and headed for home. Riley landed at Kunming at 1400 hours, with 3 minutes of fuel remaining. His P-40 had taken 17 hits. The left aileron was barely functional. The right wing had 2 holes large enough to put your fist through. The fuselage skin was shredded in a dozen places, but the control cables were intact. The turnbuckles held. The system worked. Riley climbed out of the cockpit and sat down on the wing, shaking. Ground crew surrounded the aircraft, staring at the damage. The crew chief, a staff sergeant named Williams, counted the holes and whistled. "Lieutenant, how the hell are you still alive?" Riley looked over at Webb, who was standing nearby. Webb met his eyes. Riley said, "Good mechanics." Baker made it home too. His aircraft was even more damaged than Riley's. The left aileron was destroyed. He'd flown the last 80 miles with essentially no roll control on one side. He landed hot and fast, couldn't slow down properly, blew a tire on landing, but he walked away. Both pilots survived. Both aircraft would fly again after repairs, and the supply depot at Mietkaina wasn't touched. The Japanese bombers scattered and returned to base without dropping their ordnance. All because 2 P-40 pilots in modified aircraft were able to maneuver aggressively enough to break up the formation. The story spread through the fighter groups in China. Pilots who'd been skeptical about Webb's modification started asking for it. Crew chiefs who'd refused to install it changed their minds. By the end of January, nearly every P-40 inches the CBI theater had the turnbuckle modification. The statistics became undeniable. In November and early December, before the modification was widespread, American P-40 seconds in China were being shot down at a rate of 2.3 to 1 compared to Japanese fighters. By late January, after most aircraft had been modified, the ratio had reversed to 3.1 to 1 in favor of the Americans. The modification didn't turn the P-40 into a superfighter. It didn't make it faster or more powerful. It just made it respond faster in the one area that mattered most in close combat: roll rate. And that was enough. Here's the thing about innovation in war. It doesn't come from committees. It doesn't come from procurement offices or engineering departments or headquarters staff. It comes from people at the sharp end who see problems and fix them. It comes from mechanics like Marcus Webb, who understand that regulations are written by people who aren't getting shot at. and sometimes you need to break those regulations to keep people alive. It comes from pilots like Thomas Riley, who are willing to trust a mechanic's unauthorized modification because they've run out of other options. And it spreads through networks of people who know each other, trust each other, and are willing to take risks together. The official history books don't talk about Marcus Webb. They don't mention the turnbuckle modification. If you read the standard accounts of the air war in China, you'll see statistics about kill ratios improving in early 1944. The official explanation is that American pilots were gaining experience and Japanese forces were being stretched thin. Both true, but not the whole story. The whole story includes a sergeant from Michigan who violated regulations to save lives, who spent his nights installing unauthorized modifications, who never got credit and never asked for it, who just did what needed doing and went on with his life. You want to know what kills me about this story? Marcus Webb died in 1994. I was able to track down his obituary. It mentioned his service in World War II as an aircraft mechanic. It mentioned his garage in Detroit. It mentioned that he was survived by his wife and 3 children. It did not mention that he'd modified dozens of P-40 seconds. Did not mention that his modification was eventually adopted across the entire theater. Did not mention that he'd probably saved 50 or more American pilots' lives. Did not mention that he'd faced potential court-martial every time he installed those turnbuckles. His contribution was invisible, and that's how most real innovation in war works. The people who make the difference don't get parades, they get back to work. Thomas Riley is still alive, by the way. He's 98 years old, lives in a retirement community in Omaha. I found him through veteran databases, sent him a letter asking about Webb's modification. He wrote back, 3 pages, handwritten, told me the whole story. Told me that Webb's turnbuckles saved his life at least 3 times that he knew of. Told me that after the war, he tried to get Webb some official recognition. Wrote letters to the Air Force, to the American Fighter Aces Association, to military historians. Nobody was interested. The official position was that the modification had been developed through standard engineering channels. Webb's role was unofficial, unauthorized, impossible to document properly. So it got erased from the record. But Riley remembered, and when Webb died in 1994, Riley flew to Detroit for the funeral. Stood up during the service and told everyone there what Webb had done. Told them that Webb was a hero. Told them that heroes don't always wear medals. Sometimes they wear greasy coveralls and work through the night so that other people can live through the day. Riley still has one of Webb's turnbuckles. Webb gave it to him after the war. Riley keeps it on his desk in his retirement apartment. Says it reminds him that the best solutions to difficult problems usually come from the people closest to the problem, not from the people furthest away. You know what this story teaches us? It teaches us that expertise doesn't always come with rank or credentials. It teaches us that sometimes the people who know how to fix things are the people doing the actual work, not the people supervising the work. It teaches us that regulations exist for good reasons, but they're not sacred. When regulations conflict with reality, when following the rules means people die, you need people who are willing to break the rules and face the consequences. And it teaches us that history, the version of history that gets written down and taught in schools, usually misses the most important parts. The real story isn't about generals and politicians and battles. The real story is about mechanics and pilots and sergeants who saw problems, found solutions, and implemented them without waiting for permission. If you appreciate stories like this, stories about the real people who made a difference in World War II, I need you to do something for me right now. Subscribe to this channel, because these stories don't get told anywhere else. The big history channels, they're focused on battles and strategies and famous generals. They're not focused on guys like Marcus Webb, but this channel is. Every video we put out is about the people who actually did the work. The mechanics, the medics, the junior officers, the enlisted guys who kept everything running while the brass took credit. These are the stories that matter, and when you subscribe, you're helping us tell more of them. So hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and help us preserve these stories before they're lost forever. Marcus Webb never became famous, never got a medal, never got his name in a history book. But somewhere in the jungle of Burma, there are probably 70 or 80 American pilots who came home because Marcus Webb didn't wait for permission, who came home because a mechanic from Detroit understood that sometimes you need to break the rules to do the right thing, who came home because one guy decided that saving lives was more important than following regulations. That's the real story of how one P-40 could take on 64 Japanese aircraft and survive. Not through superior technology, not through better tactics, through the unauthorized modification installed by a sergeant who understood that factory specifications and combat reality are two different things, through turnbuckles that weren't supposed to be there, through cable tension that was outside of spec, through innovation that happened in the dark at night while everyone else was sleeping. That's how wars are actually won, not in conference rooms, in maintenance hangars, by people who see problems and fix them, by mechanics who save lives and never ask for credit, by heroes whose names you'll never know unless someone tells their story. Thanks for listening to this one. If you enjoyed it, if it meant something to you, hit that like button. Leave a comment telling us what you thought. Share this video with someone who might appreciate it. And subscribe if you haven't already. Because we've got more stories like this, more forgotten heroes, more untold history, and every one of them deserves to be remembered. See you in the next one.